for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dr. Fauci, the #1 Facebook post today about vaccines is Tucker Carlson's, suggesting they don't work, going back to our exchange from before. There are calls now to take down his post by Facebook because it's become the most engaged post and fueling the anti-vaxxer movement online. Would you, it seems appropriate given what big tech needs to do to take down these anti-vaxxer claims, to take down Tucker Carlson's Facebook post as well. What do you think?
You know, Congressman, I'm really not expert enough about
okay,
what
Dr.
should be
Kessler,
taken down.
Dr. Kessler, this is your beat, vaccine hesitancy. If this is as serious a anti-vaxxer claim and it's getting the engagement it should, shouldn't we take down this Facebook post?
Vaccines work. Any suggestion that they don't would be false and misleading. And I would ask, we've been sitting here, I would just ask that all members of this committee reinforce that point to the American people.
Dr. Fauci, with regard to Facebook, Chelsea Clinton has now called for this Facebook post to be taken down and numerous others. How about you?
You know, when I was trying to answer the question when you switched over to Dr. Kessler, I'm not an expert enough on what liberty should or should not be encroached upon by taking things down from Facebook. I don't want to go on the record and say something should be taken down from Facebook because that's not my area of expertise. What one can or cannot take down from Facebook. I can comment that I certainly disagree with what he said, and I made it very clear that I disagreed with what he said.
And should he retract his statements?
Should he what?
Should Tucker Carlson retract his statements in light of your testimony today?
You know, I wish that he would not have said it. Again, I don't want to get into a back and forth because that's what happened between me and Tucker Carlson. I am too busy doing my job to going back and forth with people like Tucker Carlson. He could say what he wants to say. I wish he would not. I don't think it's productive.
Given what he has said and what he has posted on Facebook and social media, do you believe that it advances or sets back our drive to vaccinate the population?
Well, the statement he made is that he doesn't, then it looks like the vaccines might not be working. The implication was, since you're asking us to wear masks, the vaccine might not be working. My comment to that is that the vaccines were shown, the mRNA vaccines, to be between 94 and 95% effective. So my answer to him is merely one of data. Look at the data. The vaccines are highly efficacious and have been shown in the field to be highly effective. In fact, that was the third or fourth or fifth slide in my presentation.
It's a simple question, Dr. Fauci. Are his statements advancing the cause of getting us to the point where we can remove our masks and, quote unquote, exercise our liberties, or are we now setting back the program of getting to that stage?
His statements are certainly not advancing the cause of trying to get as many people vaccinated as quickly as we possibly can.
Dr. Kessler, you said that each week we're going to be delivering, or we are delivering 28 million doses of vaccine. And I assume that the demand right now meets the supply. But at some point you said it's going to plateau. And when do you expect the demand to be less than the supply?
I think over the next number of weeks.
So we'll be gathering a surplus of vaccines at that point?
It's, we are a diverse country, and there's going to be areas where there's appointments that will go unfilled, and there will be areas of the country where it's still going to be hard to get an appointment. But I think we're getting to that inflection point, and I think we all have to individually work hard and personally to talk to people, listen to people, understand people's fears, people's concerns. We have a big job ahead of us if we're going to get
If we have surplus vaccines at some point where the demand is less than the supply and it's just gathering, what are the contingency plans to do with those surplus vaccines?
We are going to work day and night, and we are to build further confidence in the American people. We know the most important thing that we can do is to invest in trusted messengers across the country. We're leading with the science. I think you've seen that this week's actions should give the American people increased confidence in the FDA and the CDC. We have a big job ahead of us, and we're not going to stop until we've vaccinated everybody that we can.
Will the gentleman from Illinois yield for a question?
Go ahead.
Gentleman yield?
Time has expired.
I can't yield you anything, but go ahead.
The gentleman's time has expired. The chair now recognizes Dr. Green for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I want to begin round two here by thanking Representative Bill Foster for his allowing me to partner with him on the GAO task force. Bill and I don't agree on a lot of political positions, but I've grown to deeply respect his scientific knowledge and his management skills as he's worked with them to make sure contracts were appropriate, operations of what Operation Warp Speed went well. And he and I did agree on sending a letter to the administration asking that we use one dose for Moderna and Pfizer until everyone's vaccinated. I still believe that's a strong position. The data from particularly our allies has shown that to be very true. Secondly, someone earlier mentioned that Tennessee's infection rate, basically mentioned our infection rate in an effort to imply that open states performed more poorly than closed states. But a simple glance at the per capita death rate paints a very clear picture that there is minimal correlation, if any, between deaths and closures and mask mandates. Florida, for example, is the third largest state. It ranks 28th in per capita deaths. Tennessee's the 16th in population, and we are 21st in per capita deaths. That's consistent across all the states. There just isn't correlation. Those statistics need to be checked and confirmed, or what was said earlier should be. Someone else asked this question earlier, and I think it's worth mentioning again. Do such conditions that were described at the Donna facility on the border conform to current CDC guidelines? The answer was very clear. It doesn't, and that begs the question, how is it okay to let 600 plus children lay row on row, shoulder to shoulder, yet the NEA says we still can't send Americans back to school? I think that's a question that we should be asking the National Teachers Association. I'm sorry. That's very frustrating to see this continued push to keep kids out of school, but it seems to be okay that we let them languish in those facilities on the border. Dr. Fauci, I have a question for you, and I'd like for you, if you could, to elaborate. I'm surprised no one's asked this question yet, and it's about the J&J vaccine. I, too, am one of those folks who believe that the Moderna vaccine, the Pfizer vaccine, I've looked very hard at the data on those. Those are safe. I took the first vaccine myself. I'm holding on the second to keep consistent with Dr. Foster and my push to have one vaccine first. But you recently made some comments about the J&J vaccine. As I understand it, there were only 6 cases of clots, and out of several million, 7 or 8 million that have been administered. I'd love for you to elaborate on this, because I'm very concerned that this halt, or what you've said about the halt, has probably contributed to things like these Facebook posts and others who are concerned about vaccine safety. So if you could kind of comment on the incidence of this clot versus the number of vaccines, and then the pause and what it may be communicating to people about the safety of the vaccines.
Thank you very much for that question. It's an important question. So the CDC and the FDA made a determination when they saw the accumulation of 6, a relatively small number, of this really quite devastating complication of an adverse event of cerebral venous sinus thrombosis with thrombocytopenia. And they did it, as they have stated very clearly, even though it is a very low level when you look at it, the number as of now would be like less than 1 per million. They did it out of an abundance of caution and called it a pause to be able to do two things. One, to examine it more carefully, to make sure that there are not a lot more out there, and to alert physicians to be on the lookout for this. But also another important component of it is that if there are more of these situations where people have this and they come to a physician, if the physicians are not aware of it, they may treat the person inappropriately because this is a clotting situation, and the standard way to treat a thrombosis is with an anticoagulant called heparin. However, in this case, heparin is contraindicated because it could actually make the situation worse. So there were two reasons to do it. One, out of an abundance of caution to see what we're dealing with, and B, to make sure they alert physicians about what to do with it. Hopefully, we'll get a decision quite soon as to whether or not we can get back on track with this very effective vaccine.
I'd love for you, though, sir, to just in your future comments about it, be very careful, because I think they are contributing to some of this vaccine hesitancy. And if I could ask you to do that in the future, just a request. Thank you. And I yield.
Thank you very much. The chair now recognizes Mr. Foster for 5 minutes.
Thank you. And just one quick question on the last subject. In your epidemiological modeling, what is the difference in the projected total mortality by the time that the pandemic burns out because of the delay that's implied by a delay in the J&J vaccine? And if you don't have a just offhand answer to that, if you could answer that for the record, it would be very, very informative, because that's the trade-off, as I perceive it, between the risk of those 1 in a million of people who would be at risk otherwise. And now I'll change back to our favorite subject here. I just want to thank you for your testimony about the long-term federal investments in science that were so crucial to getting out from under this pandemic. I've been out of science and at this crazy business for about 12 years now, and I cannot count the number of times that we Democrats have had to compromise in negotiations or give up things that we care about to defend the scientific budgets against the cuts proposed and voted for by Republicans, from Paul Ryan to Mick Mulvaney to Donald Trump. Well, that's my rant, and there's no need for you to comment on this. But now what I would like to ask you about are next generation vaccines. These may be really important, both for boosters in the US in the future and for the rest of the world to keep new variants from coming back at us from offshore. And, I've been reading about all these great concepts for next gen vaccines, the self-amplifying mRNA vaccines, the nose spritz, which could be much better for vaccine hesitancy, oral vaccines, which will be obviously great for convenience and for vaccine hesitancy, and then all these neat things like the electrophoresis devices for DNA vaccines and so on that don't have needles. Anyway, what are the promising technical approaches and the plausible timelines for these, both in the US and abroad?
Well, there are a couple. Thank you for that question. There are a couple of approaches to the evolution of variants. One of them is to actually boost against the wild-type virus. And the reason we see that, because the higher the titer of antibodies, we find that even when a variant comes along and diminishes the efficacy of the vaccine by 2, 3, or 4-fold, there's still enough cushion in the effectiveness of the vaccine that it spills over and protects against this new variant. The other approach is one that we've already started in phase 1 and 2A trials, and that is to make a boost that is specifically directed at the variant in question. The one that we're directing it at is the one that is the most problematic for us right now, theoretically, it's not dominant in the country, but theoretically it could be the most problem, and that's the South African isolate, the 351. The ultimate end game, when you talk about the next generation, would be what we call a universal SARS-CoV-2 vaccine and ultimately a universal coronavirus vaccine. And there are a number of ways of doing that. We have important and new platform technologies, and we believe, for example, that we can apply the mRNA technology to get to that goal of getting a broad response against all possible variants. These are activities that have already started with the funding that has been generously given to us by the Congress.
And are you also continuing to experiment either in the US or abroad with different dosing regimens? For example, given the phenomenal effectiveness in children of the mRNA vaccines, at least one of the mRNA vaccines, are you considering looking at giving 2 half doses or maybe only 1 dose to children and see if that is effective? Because obviously, even if we choose not to do it in the US, it will have huge advantages to the rest of the world if you can demonstrate that that sort of approach actually works.
As part of the dose, as part of the age de-escalation, which means that, for example, we know now for the Pfizer that the 12 to 15-year-olds, there was essentially 100% efficacy of that vaccine. But when you do an age de-escalation and you go from 12 to 9 years old, 9 to 6, 6 to 2, and 6 months to 2 years, there will be a dose de-escalation also on that. And perhaps Dr. Kessler can comment further on that.
Getting the dose right in children is absolutely essential. And in fact, one of the reasons why it takes longer in kids is because collecting that data is being undertaken right now. And that's, while we will have, I am confident, again, I don't want to get out ahead in front of FDA in the ACIP, but we will likely have a vaccine for adolescents from 12 to 16 over the next several months. But the younger age groups, in order to get that dose data, it will take longer.
Thank you. And I believe my time has expired, and I yield back.
I thank the gentleman for yielding back. The chair now recognizes Ms. Meliotakis for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I wanted to continue the conversation regarding our schools. And as I mentioned, the CDC had recommended a $23 billion cost to reopen. That was their estimation. In December, in that COVID bill, there was $64 billion, almost nearly triple the amount of money that was needed. And then in this last package, they put in another $110 billion, which would be 8 times the amount that the CDC estimated it would cost. Now, my question for you is, because New York City school system is still basically closed. Yes, there's some in-person instruction, elementary schools, and some at the middle school level, but the reality is if the CDC is recommending 5 days a week in-person instruction, what can you do to assist us to get that message to the local level? Because this is really having an impact, and as Dr. Fauci is from the community, from the city that I represent, so he understands maybe the impact that this is having. But from a medical standpoint, I mean, we're talking about COVID, but then this is creating all sorts of other issues: nutrition, obesity, school athletics remains shut down. I can't get 12 kids in a hockey league to be able to play. Just nonsensical stuff that we're seeing. And I understand it's a local decision, and it's about local management, but what can you and the administration do to try to talk some sense into the leadership in New York City to get our schools open, get school athletics back on track? Children, you've seen across the country, sadly, committing suicide. This is having a mental health, another public health crisis that's being created as a result. Parents are trying to go to work. You know, it's really hard, particularly on single mothers. The after-school centers are closed. I mean, what can we do as a federal government, as an administration, to try to, are you meeting with them? Are you communicating with them regularly? Are you visiting with these chancellors on the local level to come up with a plan to meet this 100-day goal that the president sent that we're about to reach any day now?
So we put forward this operational guidance. We've been collaborating with the Department of Ed. We have been talking to the teachers' unions, and we've been talking to individual states. What I can say is that the guidance speaks to all of the layered mitigation strategies that need to be in place in order for this to be safely done. And schools are working towards that in many of these places. I do want to say that we have definitively said that schools should be the first place to open and the last place to close. Many of the outbreaks associated with children are happening on the athletic field. They are happening in wrestling, they are happening in hockey, they are happening in basketball. So we have guidance that limits the school sports in the context of hive transmission.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to give Mr. Scalise 30 seconds and the remaining of my time to Mr. Jordan.
Thank you. I appreciate the gentlelady from New York. Real quick, because there were some comments that were brought up regarding Tucker Carlson, some things that were said, but other parts of the context that were left out. So I did just want to include, on Mr. Carlson's show on Wednesday, he did say, quote, "Wait a second, who's doubting that vaccines work? For the record, we never for a minute doubted it." He goes on to say, "So when they said this stuff works, we never questioned it." So I think it's important to put that on the record as well, because that was left out, I think a little bit unfairly. Yield back.
Mr. Jordan?
I thank the gentlelady for yielding. That was subject I wanted to touch on. We just had a member, I wish he was still here, that's why I tried to ask him a question, Representative Krishnamurthy, actually lobbying for, Tucker Carlson, a member of the press, actually lobbying for his statements to be censored. A member of the government telling someone in the press, advocating for someone in the press to have their statements censored. And Dr. Fauci says I'm ranting when I talk about the First Amendment. For goodness sake, you got a member of Congress in the government saying someone in the press should be denied their ability to speak that statement. They should be taken off of Facebook, taken down. This is how scary it's gotten. And the longer it goes, Dr. Fauci, the longer it goes, the scarier it's going to be for the liberties that we as American citizens have. And that has been my point the entire time. So I wish the gentleman were still here, but I cannot believe what I heard, where a member of Congress is saying and asking you all a question, and you all won't give the right answer, which is, of course, his statement shouldn't come down. It would have been easy to say, Dr. Fauci, if you actually cared about the First Amendment, of course, I disagree with his statement. I know you do. I don't know that I disagree with everything he said, because he just was put in context when you get the whole context. But you disagreed with this statement, but you should have said he can say what he wants, shouldn't be taken down. I just respectfully disagree. I yield back to the gentlelady from New York.
The gentleman's time.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, could I just, to clarify it, Congressman Jordan, I definitely think he has the right to say whatever he wants to say. Well, he was talking about things that I think are legal or not legal about taking things down. Why don't we just make it so that you understand very clearly that I think that Tucker Carlson can say whatever he wants to say. It's freedom of speech.
Well, God bless you. I appreciate it.
Well, you know, I would just say, Mr. Jordan, that there's something about this country that we pay entertainers very well. I don't care about how much money they make, but I want them to be recognized as entertainers.
Tucker Carlson is a member of the media. He's a member of the press.
Tucker Carlson, in my not-so-humble opinion, is an entertainer. And with that, I'll give 5 minutes to Ms. Waters.
Thank you so very much, Mr. Chairman. Again, Dr. Fauci, I'd like to thank you for your courage and your integrity. And I want to ask you about a couple of friends that I have that I think have been considered or is being considered long haulers. Now, they tell me about some of their symptoms. I think one has not gotten the taste and the smell returned. The other one is having, I think, headaches and some other kinds of things. What can they expect? Should they get booster shots? What can be done for the long haulers?
We are now in, that's a great question, Congressman Waters. We are studying very intensively now what is a real and unfortunate syndrome. And that is a certain percentage of people, and we're collecting large cohorts now to find out exactly what that percent is. It ranges in some observational studies from 10% to 20 to 25% of people who have varying levels of involvement of COVID-19. Some are in the hospital, some are in the hospital seriously ill, some are taken care of at home and are out of work or whatever for months. But at the end of the day, when they clear the virus from the body, they have this peculiar persistence of a constellation of symptoms that are unexplainable because the virus is gone, and yet they have profound fatigue, muscle aches, sleep disorders, temperature dysregulation, fast heartbeat called tachycardia, and a thing called brain fog, which means they have difficulty focusing on anything, on a computer or on reading. So what we're trying to do is to find out, A, what is the percent of people? B, is there an underlying common cause of that? Because up to now, on superficial looking, there's no specific laboratory test that's giving us any clues. But it's a real phenomenon, and we're taking it very seriously. As a matter of fact, we've invested $1.15 billion in a multi-institution type of an approach with the NIH, the CDC, multiple institutes within the NIH. It's something we take very seriously.
Well, let me just continue with that. We're talking about the various variants, and we're also hearing some conversation about the possibility of booster shots that may be necessary. Would there be a different booster shot for different variants? For example, you described one coming out of South Africa. Someone alluded to one coming out of Brazil. We've heard about the UK. Would you think that if we have to have booster shots, it may be different kinds of booster shots depending on the variant that's a problem?
Yeah, that's a great question, and that's one of the things I try to address in a partial answer to one of the questions. There are a couple of ways of looking at variants. One is to boost against what we call the wild type, the underlying original one. If you get it high enough, it could spill over into protection to the variant. The other is to specifically make a boost against the variant. The problem with that is that if you get more and more variants, that's almost like playing whack-a-mole. You hit this one, then you go to the other one, you go to the other one. And that's the reason why what we're putting a lot of effort in is to try and get a more universal vaccine that would cover all different types of variants. That's the ultimate end game. But until then, we're trying to isolate and find out what the most damaging or potentially dangerous variant is, and to make a special boost against that. And that's what we're doing.
That's very good to hear, and I'm going to be paying a lot of attention to that. Because without having any specific scientific knowledge, I just think that there may come a time when we have to have booster shots. Now, having said that, I want to talk just a bit about something right here at home. That's very simple. The members of Congress are congregating in the elevators. They pile in the elevators. And when I am on an elevator and it stops, I will only let 2 other people on because I won't ride with more than 3. And some say, well, I've had shots, so I'm wearing my mask. What advice do you have for us to basically be more safe and to be fine examples of what to do to prevent the virus?
Yeah, there are a couple of things to be done. I think we should encourage all members of Congress to get vaccinated because I think that would be really good for their own personal protection as well as for the community of the Congress. The other thing is that what we do in some of our federal buildings, I know we do it at the NIH. When you have the elevator, they have these things here that are corner and they say no more than 4 if the elevator is a certain size and no more than 2 if it's a much smaller size. And it actually works, and people abide by that, and they respect that. And I think that's a good thing if we can get that done.
thank you for your advice. Again, I appreciate you so very much. Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you, young lady, for yielding back. The chair now recognizes Ms. Miller Meeks for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dr. Walensky, since this pandemic started, as a physician and former director of the Iowa Department of Public Health, I have referred to this as life versus life. Not life versus the economy, not life versus liberty, but life versus life. At that time, I said that we would see, with hospitals closed, with businesses closed, child care closed, that we would see increased deaths from cancer treatments not being given, also cancer not being detected, from drug overdose, suicide, depression, mental health, and now we have certainly that data. We have San Francisco Chronicle published earlier this year that the rate of drug overdose deaths, even with Narcan being rapidly dispensed and in the public, was over 30% higher than it had been the year before. We also know same statistics out of Japan. We also know from Las Vegas that having closed their schools, what forced the Las Vegas School District to open their schools was the publication that in the New York Times that from March 16th to June 30th of 2020, there were 6 suicides in young children, and between July 1st and December 31st, there were additional 12, 18 suicides, the youngest of which was 9 years old, which is tragic. So my question for you is, do you know how many excess deaths, not COVID, but excess non-COVID related deaths have been incurred during this past year?
There was an MMWR report out today, actually, that describes from January 2020 to February 2021 excess deaths of about 500,000, about 75% of which are attributable to COVID.
Thank you. So, excess deaths of 500,000, which is somewhat similar to what we have. So thank you for that.
75 of which are attributable to COVID, so that's the same.
Non-COVID related excess deaths was what I was asking. But I'll go to my next question, but thank you for that. I was at the border earlier this week in the Rio Grande Valley sector, and thank you, Representative Waters, for bringing up congregating in the elevators and crowding. Because when I was there at the Donna processing facility, that facility was at 420% capacity. They had brought it down from 5,000 per day to 3,500 per day. The facility was not built for that. While I was there, as a woman and a mother, I was concerned about young women being smuggled into the country, brought across without any parental support or parental guidance, and asked them about pregnancy, rape, sexual assault. And they informed me that the week before they had an 11-year-old girl recently pregnant and a girl between 11 and 15 who the day she arrived at that facility gave birth to twins. So does pregnancy put individuals or these young people, they're not being tested for COVID, we already know that, but does it put them at a higher risk for severe illness from COVID-19?
Epidemiologic studies say that outcomes of COVID in pregnant women are increased ICU risk and other things.
Okay. And does the overcapacity in the shelter put them at higher risk for COVID-19?
Crowding is a risk for COVID-19.
Yeah. So I've been working on vaccine hesitancy throughout. As soon as the vaccine, and thank the previous administration and President Trump for getting the vaccine to this point in time, but it's really the nation's vaccine, not a particular president's vaccine. And working on that, and even this weekend on Saturday was able to vaccinate 20 young individuals who were attending a meeting. And so we've talked about vaccine hesitancy and the need to get across that, but I'm wondering if, Mr. Chair, I'd like to introduce this article into the record, if I may. From September of 2020, when Dana Bash asked Vice President Harris if she would get the vaccine, and quote, I would say that I would not trust Donald Trump, and it would have to be a credible source of information that talks about the efficacy and the reliability of whatever he's talking about. I will not take his word for it. Is this the kind of information you think that also contributes to vaccine hesitancy?
I think we all have a role to get vaccinated, and I would encourage everybody to get vaccinated with the FDA-authorized vaccines.
So I fully respect her freedom of speech, as Dr. Fauci respects Tucker Carlson's, but I think, yes, it's incumbent upon all of us to be transparent, to be ethical, to give information, and this also applies to the how we handled the J&J vaccine as well, too, the pause. Thank you so much, and again, I appreciate all of you being here and your testimony today.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes himself for 5 minutes to close the second round of questioning. I wish to say that I remember the statement made by Vice President Harris, but I also seem to remember that she had a very public vaccination, very public. She and the President as well. I'm old enough to remember the Tuskegee experiment, and I know what hesitancy that has caused. I'm also remembering the polio vaccines, one being a shot, which we owe to the genius of Dr. Jonas Salk, the other being a little drop of serum on a lump of sugar, owed to the genius of Albert Sabin. I need not tell you which one of those was preferred. And so I would not have to explain to you which community got what vaccine. And that is why the Vice President was so public with her vaccination. And that is why I was very public with mine, having received my second one on January 7th. As you can imagine, being the day after January 6th, my mind was on a lot more than the vaccination, but I thought it serious enough to have that vaccination done on that day in the same place that had been ransacked the day before. And I think it's important, in my opinion, that we recognize mask mandates and closures, and though it seems as if a few of my colleagues here believe that mask mandates and closures haven't helped save lives. That's what they've said here. I'd like to know, Dr. Fauci, would you agree with that?
I believe that mask mandates have helped.
How about you, Dr. Walensky?
I agree with Dr. Fauci.
Dr. Kessler?
Absolutely, Mr. Chairman.
Well, I want to thank the experts here for that, and I would hope that the public looking in or listening in on the sharing today will take to heart the fact that the scientists, the people who have spent their lives in this field, saving lives, will take heed. And as they listen to the words of those who haven't spent a day studying these issues or practicing them, those who spend their time practicing the words of persuasion rather than adhering to the scientific research that got rid of polio and so many other diseases. You know, I've taken my shingles shot. And from what I know about these kinds of diseases, when the scientists tell me that the research says they will be helpful to my comfort and well-being, I'm going to take it. And I urge all of my constituents and all others who may have any confidence in my opinions to please follow the scientists and get vaccinated. With that, I yield back, and I will call an end to the second round of questions, and I will now yield to my ranking member for any closing comments he would like to make.
I want to thank Chairman Clyburn for having this hearing. Really appreciate our witnesses for coming. I know for Dr. Fauci, been back a few times. When you look at some of the conversations we've had, I know when I listen to constituents of mine, they want to follow the science and get back to their lives as best as they can. And we're over a year into this now. We see some states who have opened more broadly using science, and some states that have stayed shut down, in many cases going against the science. And again, you can look at the chart. The states that are the most closed down right now have some of the highest incidents of COVID transmission. And you look at number 50. Out of 50, Texas is probably one of the most open states. So the science shows and the data shows that you can safely reopen. Some are just choosing not to. And that's really where we get to the concern. When you look at some states that are practicing more political science while ignoring medical science, that's what angers so many of us. You look at school reopenings, and I appreciate Dr. Fauci and Dr. Walensky both said, if you follow the CDC guidance, which says socially distance and wear a mask, every school should be open today. And yet about half of our schools in America are not educating kids in the classroom. And the science is real clear on this. Long-term damage is being done to those kids. Some are committing suicide. Some are turning to drugs. Some have lost a generational ability to have the same opportunity as anyone else. This is a national disgrace. 10 years from now, people are going to look back and go, how did America let that happen to a generation of kids where for over a year they did not learn the same way as everybody else in America learned? When you watch a teachers union head send his kids to private school while telling the teachers in the public school system that they shouldn't teach kids in the classroom, you want to talk about racial disparity in this country? This is a national disgrace that's occurring before our very eyes. And instead of waiting 10 years and looking back on how did we lose a generation of millions of young kids, let's do something about it now. Every one of us should be able to stand up, Mr. Chairman, Republican and Democrat. Say whatever you think of unions, whatever you think of school choice. If your school system doesn't want to educate your kids in the classroom and the science says do it, absolutely do it. If you want to take their money and not educate their kids, shouldn't you be able to take that money somewhere else where they're willing to educate your kid? Because your kid's going to lose his opportunity at life if this goes on. So much damage has already been done. We've got to undo the damage. And the science, the medical science, backs it up. The American Academy of Pediatrics, CDC. You don't need to look far. You don't need to reinvent the wheel because it's out there. What you can do to open schools today. You don't need billions more dollars. We've spent billions of dollars to reopen schools. The bill that was passed, the $1.9 trillion massive spending bill, over 90% of which had nothing to do with COVID medicine, the money going to schools wasn't even dedicated to opening schools. And so people would beg the question, what's the money for then? Because I want my kid back in school. It's denying that kid opportunity. They're committing suicide. We ought to be concerned about those numbers. Then let's turn to the border. And again, I appreciate the testimony from our witnesses because when confronted with the pictures that the Biden administration will not let the press see, the Biden administration is keeping the press out of this facility in Donna. It's a national disgrace what's going on there. But more importantly, as both Dr. Fauci and Dr. Walensky attested, it's a violation of CDC guidelines. When you got a facility designed for 250 people with over 4,000 crammed in it, kids on top of kids. That's a violation of every CDC protocol out there. And this isn't some private sector entity because your business would be shut down in America if you were doing this. But because the Biden administration is running it and keeping the press out, it remains open today. Last Friday, that was what I saw. Major violation of CDC's own policy when they say in the guidance regarding Mexico, very high level of COVID-19 in Mexico. So if you're an American taxpayer CDC, and I know Dr. Walensky's backed this up, CDC says before you travel back to the United States, all air passengers coming to the United States, including U.S. citizens and fully vaccinated people, are required to have a negative COVID-19 test. And yet, if you come across the border illegally, many of these young kids are given a free airplane ticket with no COVID test. Border Patrol agents telling you at least 10% have COVID in this facility crammed on top of each other, which, as we all know, based on science, way more than 10% are going to walk out onto an airplane with COVID and transmit it to the rest of the country. This is insanity. It has to stop. President Biden, go to the border and see this for yourself, and then pull out your pen and reverse the executive orders you created that have created this national disgrace. Let's solve this based on medical science. I thank again our witnesses. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.